In this video, I'll talk you through all the basics of all grain brewing. We'll take you through each of the steps, we'll show you all the kit required, and at the end you'll have a beer that you can drink. Now I think the simplest way to do this all grain brewing thing is to get yourself a kit from one of the big providers. I'll list all the ones below that I usually use, and there's quite a few that do these kits. But what that means is you get everything in one pack. You get all of your grain, you get all of your hops, and you get yeast sachets to use at the end of the brew. Now what you'll also get in your pack is this, which is a brew sheet basically. It'll have all of your ingredients listed, and it'll have all of the methods that you need. It goes across onto here, and that gives you all the methods that you're going to be using. This is quite important, and it's something that you'll refer back to. There is software that you can use, which I'll also go through in a second, which can sort of map out what's on here. But this is the basic details. You'll need to use this as your go-to. What I have today is an oatmeal porter. This is from a brewery called Daya. They're normally known for their hoppier beers, but this is an absolutely excellent porter. I've had it from the brewery, and I've also had it from someone who's done a homebrew version, and they were both brilliant. So that's what I've gone for today. Now, depending on what beer you actually buy in kit form, you get a different set of grains. So this one has its main grain bag here, and then it has all its speciality grains included in a separate bag. And sometimes these are all just in one big bag, or they're in several separate ones, but they all go in the same vessel, so it's quite simple. But these are all nicely weighed out. You know that everything's going to be in perfect proportions. You don't have to buy little bits of each grain, so it makes everything nice and simple. You will then get these little sachets, which are pre-weighed out hops. It'll also have on the kit when you use these hops. That means you're not wasting any. You've got exactly what you need. You just open this at the right time. You know they're going to be nice and fresh, and you can use them just when you need them. And then lastly, you'll get your yeast sachets. Sometimes you'll get one, sometimes two. It just depends on the makeup of the beer and how much it requires in terms of numbers of yeast. But this is an US-05, which is a fairly standard, clean flavoured yeast. It won't give you any sort of expression in terms of yeast flavour, but it's just nicely going to ferment the beer that gets out of the way, which is what we want for this beer. Now you can just use the brew sheet as I've said, but you can also use a variety of apps that help you along the brew day. That will do things like help you with timers and tell you what to do next. It will also do things like calculate the water that's required. Water's a whole other topic that we can go into a lot more detail, which I'll do another video on, but just in general, just getting the right levels of water for the system that you have is a great step forward. Now this software is pretty detailed, and you can go into all sorts of different facets of brewing on there, but if you keep simple and just use the bits that you need, they can be really helpful. I use one called Brewfather. There's also one called Beersmith, and there's a variety of others, but those are the two main ones that people tend to use. They're both fully functional, and they have lots and lots of different things. They're all also up to date with all of the hops and malts that come out, so you know that you're going to find the one that you need to find on there. Once you've got your recipe dialed into your app, you're then going to have the method listed here, which the only ones you really need to worry about are the mash temperature, the length of the mash, and then the boil time. You can see from here we've got a mash temperature of 67 and a 60-minute mash that we need to do. That just means that we need to steep those grains for 60 minutes in a 67 degrees C mash temperature. So they were just steeping those grains to get those sugars out for that amount of time. Once that's done and we get to the point where we're boiling, we then need to boil for 60 minutes as said here. Now some things that can be confusing are the timings of the hops. Here you can see you've got 10 grams of Magnum, and FWH means first wort hop. So that means that they go in as soon as you pull the grains out of the water. And then once you start warming up that boil, sometimes it will say boil 60, so that means you're boiling them for 60 minutes, but this is actually before that happens. This is supposed to soften the bitterness of the hops, which it does seem to do, but that's what that means, so you put that in the beginning. And then the Bramling cross is at 0 minutes, and that's 50 grams of that goes in. So that means at 0 minutes, so that means once your boil is complete, you then chuck those in for that last few minutes while you're cooling down your wort. Now, these are obviously all pre-weighed, so you don't need to worry about getting that correct amount out, but just something to be aware. Now this is the screen of Brewfather, and as you can see I've already loaded in the different parts of my recipe. I've got all of the main malts in here under fermentables. If you want to, you can go in and add another one. You would just search here. Now if we go in and click on crisp, you can see all of the different malts that they have. It's important that you pick the right one because they will all impact the recipe in different ways. And if we come out of here, you can then see underneath you've got your hops, which is the same principle, and then you've also got the yeast that you have to pick down there. And then it will ask you what temperature you want to brew at, and that will all be included within your pack. With all that pre-planning done, it's now time to actually move on to brew some beer. So let's get on with it. My brewing system is a Brewzilla. I think it's the version 3, which is the newest one out at the moment, which has worked flawlessly for me since I've got it. I did have a Grainfather S40 before, which caused quite a bit of problems for me, but I replaced it with this one and it's been no bother since. So water. It's a fairly important thing, but something you don't want to get too worried over at the beginning. You can use your tap water if it's a fairly nice tap water, so if you enjoy drinking it or you don't mind drinking it at home, then usually it's okay to use for your brewing. The one thing I would suggest is you get some sodium metabisulfate, which is Campden tablets, and that basically dechlorinates the water. So that's important in most places because most tap water will be quite chlorinated. We have quite a lot of chlorine in our water, so I do use that anyway. The alternative is to just get something like these big bottles, which come in 5 litres. These are the ones I think from Morrison's, but everywhere does them for fairly cheap, and you know then that you've got quite a good quality of water to start with, and just use that as your base water. The other thing with water is you may want to invest in a sparge water heater. Alternatively, you can just warm it up in the kettle, but it's a little less scientific. The sparge water heater just allows you to warm something to a particular temperature, say sort of 75 or something like that, and that's the exact temperature that you want to sparge at. Now, I've got one that is just a tea caddy. It's nothing special. You don't need anything special for this. It's just something that can control the temperature and heat it to the right temperature. As you can see, my Brewzilla has just kicked in. We're starting to warm up that water. And something else that Brewfather does for you is figure out the strike temperature of your water. Now, you've got your temperature of your mash, which for this one is 67 degrees C. What you'll find is if you chuck your grain in, which is obviously cold, and today is a pretty cold day anyway, it will then lower the temperature of the water. So for a while, your mash won't be at the temperature you want it to be. It will be a few degrees cooler, and that can be quite important. So with that in mind, it tells you with this one to higher the strike temperature to 72.2, which is what we've done. Okay, so you'll see me here mashing in, and you can see I'm doing that one part at a time, and that's to avoid any dough balls that are forming in the water, and that's where the malt hits the water and forms into a ball, and that will really affect your mash efficiency, which is really just how much sugar is extracted from the grains themselves. So what you don't want is a really watery beer rather than the full-bodied beer that we should be getting. And then you'll see me here. This is the speciality grains going in afterwards. You don't have to do it that way around. You can just do them all at once, all together, or alternate them, or however you like, really. As long as that gets mixed in the water, it's however you want to do it. And now we're mashed in. That's when we hit start on our timers on the app, and that begins the process of actually brewing the beer on there, and then that gives you a timer that you can carry on with. With the mash complete, we need to raise our grain out of that wort. And this is done in 2 steps on my unit. So this is the first one, and you allow that to drain for a little while. I'm getting the hops ready there for the first wort hop. A little sniff, because that's the best bit of the brew day. And then we move on to the next step of raising it onto the second rungs there. You've got to be a little bit careful, because if you don't get those right, it could be a bit of a disaster. Once that's all drained, we take that off the bed completely, and then we put our hops in. And these go in before it begins boiling, so now the wort is beginning to raise in temperature, and those hops are in there. And then we put that grain bed back on. The reason being, we're going to put our sparge screen in, and then we're going to begin sparging, and that's with all of the water that we've set aside to sparge with. Once the sparge is complete, you want to put your lid on just to raise the temperature a little bit quicker, but that does need to be removed before you get to the full boil. As you can see here, we're getting to the point of reaching a full boil. This is where the hot break will happen. That's basically where that foam goes down, and then you'll see it here. We then turns into a rolling boil, as you see here. It does need that strong rolling boil. 10 minutes before the end, you need to put your chiller in, and that's just to sanitize it. It makes it much easier than sanitizing the whole unit, because you've got a boiling wort to put it in. And at 10 minutes, you also put in the 10-minute hops that we had from the original recipe. Then it's time to turn that water on and get that chilling down to your temperature, in this case 19 degrees. So that's the brew day complete, and we've now got a chilled wort and it's ready to transfer into the fermenter. Now most of you will have something like this, which is basically just a bucket with a hose on the front, or a siphon to bring the beer out, which you can just turn like this, and that will let you drain it into your bottles or your kegs, or however you're going to do it from there. I've got something a little bit more complicated, in that I've got this pressurized fermenting vessel. You don't need one of these. This has got sanitizer in, it's ready to go, so it's ready to transfer now. But like I say, you don't really need one of those. The bucket will be absolutely fine for what we're doing today. But now I will get it transferred and get it in there. After all that hard work, the beer is now in the fermentation vessel. As I said, you could use a bucket or anything for this. I now have what is basically a fridge that can be controlled in terms of temperature for this fermentation to take place. Again, you don't need anything as fancy as that. This yeast needs to ferment at around 18 to 20 degrees, which is pretty much room temperature anyway. So with a simple beer like this, or any sort of ale or anything like that, that could be done at room temperature. So you could just take your bucket into your living room, or any room that's keeps it sort of maintained at a standard temperature, and just leave it there to do its thing. Most important thing, don't open the lid. So the killer of most beers is the oxygen that comes into contact with the beer, so that oxidizes, and then it can leave you with a horrible beer at the end of it. So that's the most important thing. Put the yeast in, put it at a good temperature, and leave it to do its thing for at least sort of 7 days. This is the last step of the process. We've got to add the yeast, and then whenever we do anything at this point, after the beer's been cooled, it's important to sanitize all the parts, because anything that comes into contact that might have any sort of bacteria on it can then infect the beer. So we just got to put this into here without touching anything. And that's one. And then we've got 2 packs for this one. That's all in the fermentation vessel. The yeast's in and he's ready to go. Now just to close the lid on that one. As I said, this is a bit of a fancy contraption compared to what is really required. It is basically just a polystyrene shell, but that means that you can control the temperature nice and easily. When I bought this, I didn't have a fridge that I could dedicate just to doing this fermentation, so I just bought this as a way to control it. But for a simple beer like this, as I said, you don't particularly need this. This is just a fancy way of doing it. And now with that temperature probe in, this lid just goes on, and effectively all it has on the front is just a control panel and a little fan which is heating and cooling, and that's it. He's all in there, and I'll see that in 7 days for a check. So it's now been 7 days. The beer has finished fermenting. We've pretty much hit exactly where we expected to, so we've got the ABV that we were expecting. So after that 7 days is finished and the fermentation is finished, we then set this thing to chill. If you don't have something like this, you can just put it outside over an evening and it will have the same sort of effect. All we're really looking for is for the sediment to drop and to make it nice and clear, or as clear as we can get it for the next stage, which in my case will be kegging, or it could just be bottling for your option, depending on where you're at. So with all the fermentation finished, let's get some beer in a glass and just have a taste. So after all the hard work, this is the finished beer. As I said before, it's an oatmeal porter. It's obviously hard to tell given it's a dark beer, but it's pretty clear. Not really anything left in that after it's chilled. It's got a fairly reasonable head on it. So the beer itself is sort of a mixture of smoke and chocolate and coffee. It's very, very complex and it's lovely. But you can make any beer you like in the same sort of way. So let me know in the comments what you made.